2016. How young and innocent we all were. If I ask you to recall a significant event, culturally and socially, specifically in the United States, that transpired in 2016, what would you think of first? Marvel movies! If you said Captain America Civil War, you were right. In the 10 years since its original release, let's look back on Captain America Civil War and discuss why I feel and had felt all the way back since I originally saw it that it mishandled Tony Stark's past trauma and consequently compromised an opportunistic setup to parallel his grief to that of Helmut Zemo, the primary antagonist and orchestrator of the film's main events. He is the most iconic of the MCU villains, of course. But just in case, let's recap, pun intended, the events of Captain America Civil War 2016. Okay, 1 year post the events of the Age of Ultron, and also following the emotional turmoil that was Iron Man 3, Tony Stark hosts a conference at MIT where he demonstrates this holographic technology with the acronym BARF. BARF. Don't know what that's about. But he uses it specifically to reconstruct the night that his parents died and showcases the final conversation that he had with them and the dismissive attitude that he had. His three-dimensional visualization allows him to alter that memory and insert himself into it and essentially change his words and tone in consideration with his now retrospective awareness that this truculent conversation would be the last conversation that he would ever have with his parents before they died. Following this presentation, he is confronted by a woman who blames the Avengers for her son's death as a result of the battle with Ultron. She does not blame Ultron, she specifically blames the Avengers. Next, a few of the Avengers are in Lagos, in Nigeria, and they attempt to contain an explosion by a terrorist organization, and Wanda, just in attempting to control it, loses control and accidentally kills civilians and aid workers from Wakanda. So as a result of all of this, the frequent collateral devastation and casualties that the Avengers have caused in their missions, Tony and the UN propose the Sokovia Accords, which create an international council under the UN to assume control over the deployment of the Avengers and monitor any development of future weapons or superhumans. Now here is where the Civil War comes in. Basically, Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, Captain America, adopt oppositional perspectives on this, representing the subjugation of the Avengers to external regulatory bodies, Tony, and independent self-governments, Steve, respectively. Each perspective is presented with nuance, and the sides that each member of the Avengers eventually align themselves with should have theoretically elucidated their personal experiences and histories with organizations such as S.H.I.E.L.D. and the UN. The accuracy of this is a little questionable, and some people argue whether or not Black Widow should have gone on one side or the other, but that's not the point of this, so moving on. Okay, so we go over to Vienna, and there Zemo detonates a bomb, which kills the current king of Wakanda, who is T'Challa's father, and he's the Black Panther. So this is readily attributable, based on security footage, to Bucky Barnes, who is, if we recall the original Captain America movie, the childhood best friend of Steve Rogers, and someone that he cares about deeply, but has also been manipulated and basically forced to don the identity of the assassin, the Winter Soldier. So Bucky, completely mind-controlled by Zemo, who was cognizant of the code necessary to control him, is released from containment. Steve is quick to defend Bucky against the allegations, and the two abscond to Siberia in pursuit of Zemo, who is specifically looking for a high-security prison there that does contain other individuals who are similar to Bucky. They're superhuman and have the capacity to be controlled given the proper code. And these enhanced soldiers are currently kept there in stasis. The fractured Avengers then duke it out in an airport. Tony, as well as secretly T'Challa, follow Steve and Bucky to that facility in Siberia, where eventually Tony does accept Bucky's innocence the reality of his innocence, and he joins the pair in pursuit of Zemo. Zemo, surprisingly, has not activated the soldiers and instead has killed them, professing that these heightened, enhanced human beings are a danger. He reveals that his family was one of the ones, unfortunately, who died in the battle against Ultron in Sokovia. So just when it seems that the Avengers are coalescing, once again, that they're coming together, Zemo shows footage that shows the night of Tony's parents' death. The car crash was not what eventually killed them, it was Bucky. Tony is, of course, incredibly incited by the knowledge of this, and he turns to Steve, who knew. And then the fight begins, the true Civil War. So they fight, they beat the crap out of each other. Steve and Bucky then piss off, and T'Challa decides to have this conversation with Zemo, in which he decides not to emulate this murderous need for retributive violence that Zemo represents, but instead take him into custody. Steve sends Tony a wonderful little care package, in which he apologizes for not accepting the Accords and for basically kicking the crap out of him and everything else that transpired in the course of the film. And then some other stuff happens, which is not necessarily pertinent to the discussion that we're going to have, so we're just going to say, that was it, the end. Game over. So let's talk about the schism itself, and let's delineate the specific reasons for the individual opinions that caused this divide between Steve and Tony. Steve, through his experiences that were depicted in the events of the Winter Soldier, is intimately cognizant of the failures of bureaucracy and is understandably suspicious of the supposed incorruptibility of these powerful associations and organizations such as S.H.I.E.L.D., who had been infiltrated in these prior films that seek to control the Avengers. So taking this all in, going back to Tony, his leadership over the Avengers and being the face of its decisions and consequently its failures puts the weight of that blame of the cost of human life and property onto him, and it influences him terribly. His guilt and remorse would cause him to want to cede control over the group to the UN as specifically a self-preservation method, and guilt is a true theme of Civil War. So the film introduces, at the beginning, Tony's internal conflict with guilt, as it pre-existed the Avengers, beginning with the trauma that he still suffers from, appertaining to the final interactions he had with his parents prior to their deaths. Civil War specifically expounds upon this moment and its emotional significance to Tony, who creates BARF, the visualization technology, to specifically simulate this final conversation and allows him to enter it and alter it and allow him to respond with the kindness and the love that he wishes, retrospectively, that he could have expressed to his parents at the time. His desires to alter the past and the invention of a means to temporarily experience that painful memory again and again with hope of changing something that cannot ever be changed is basically continuously excoriating himself for a mistake in the past and is preventing him from ever moving forward and moving on. So this recursive cycle of blame and stagnation is explicitly contrasted by Steve's relationship to Bucky. Despite the incontrovertible swaths of pain and death that Bucky has caused as the Winter Soldier, Steve still defends him because he's cognizant of the external manipulation and mind control that Bucky was under. He acknowledges the externalization of fault. So Steve, if we want to look thematically, represents forgiveness, or the acknowledgement, just in general, of the existence of numerous confounding factors which contributed to the mistakes that were made by someone he truly cares about. And therein lies the primary moral and philosophical divide between Tony and Steve. So now Tony, while wallowing in self-blame, sees the reveal of Bucky's responsibility in his parents' demise as alleviation of his inner pain. And despite his natural logical propensities and likely awareness deep within his mind that Bucky could not choose or truly consent to his actions, the opportunity to have a single, easy target for this latent guilt is overwhelming to him. His judgment is therefore compromised, and his violent reaction is directly born from the externalized projection of his desire to punish himself over his perceived role in his parents' death. So if we're looking thematically and metaphorically, this exaggerated effort to seek the reprieve of inner guilt and an alternate person or cause to blame and convict in the form of taking vengeance is represented specifically within the character of Helmut Zemo. Still can't say that name. So to speak a little bit about blame itself, blame is intrinsically complicated, intrinsically complex as well. It can be sort of concentric and propagating outward. While it's important to seek the true lineage and derivation of fault for the purpose of learning and determining preventative measures, leveraging the residual emotional damage against any single solitary reason picked out of that whole line of nebulous, ambiguous, amorphous reasons, and attributing it to one person or thing, is really unfair and frankly overly simplistic and inaccurate. It's reductive and it's useless at best, pernicious and potentially murderous at worst. Now to get into a little bit the trouble that I have with the film and why I feel like Tony's arc is generally incomplete is that there is recognition of this discussion on guilt and its transmogrification into the compulsion for revenge. However, instead of creating this interesting parallel between Tony and Zemo, this conversation appertaining to guilt and vengeance is given to Zemo and T'Challa. And now T'Challa's an amazing character. He was really wonderful, and this film served as his introduction to the MCU, so it was important for his inclusion. It seemed a little forced and kind of an unfortunate decision, in my opinion, to give this arc, this ending of this storyline, to T'Challa instead of Tony, because it's a very powerful arc to give someone whom we as an audience don't really know enough about to have a true stake in his growth and transcendence for this desire for retribution. His father was killed, he seeks punishment, then decides to forego it and capture him instead. It is a somewhat common conversation in the superhero genre, isn't it? About foregoing revenge, vengeance, and his motivations therefore are very direct, they're very obvious, and they're not really revelatory or even elucidating to his character specifically. Conversely, Tony's experience with guilt is more complicated, more complex, and is intrinsically integrated into the larger conversation that the film is trying to have appertaining to the Avengers and the control over their actions. His personal story and latent grief is absorbed into this greater conversation about self-blame over the deaths that the Avengers have unintentionally caused, including Zemo's family. So therefore, why wasn't this discussion had between Tony and Zemo? Zemo could have been more explicitly compared and contrasted with Tony, as he too cannot contend with the pain of his momentous loss, nor can he move on. So Zemo represents what Tony could become if he were to allow the perniciousness of repressed emotions and the inability to live with guilt and grief and pain to overtake him and to manifest as violence and the need for vengeful actions. So I personally think to adequately complete his work, Tony truly needed recognition over his misplaced rage. Without this explicated justification, the film almost seems to be implying that inflicting physical beatings when in a state of repressible anger is a viable reaction and means of temporarily dissipating conflict between parties. It's not really the greatest lesson to be teaching people, is it? Tony knows deep down that Bucky is not at fault. in the same way that he cannot be made to take responsibility for every mistake of the Avengers. Wouldn't it have been a stronger moment of character development if Steve had realized this during the confrontation? I think maybe, perhaps he could have implored Tony to see reason, to better understand his true motivation underlying this violent act, this violent castigation, and to help him realize Zemo's influence and manipulation of these repressed emotions. In holding the mirror up to nature, Steve, as this film's beacon and representation of forgiveness and moving forward, would have helped Tony to finally free himself from the corrosive guilt and self-blame that he had held on to for all of these years. And only upon this acknowledgement should Tony be able to finally and eventually forgive Steve and Bucky, and at last, himself. So, those are just my thoughts though. What do you guys think? Granted, I only explored Tony's arc as it appears within the confines and context of this film and the films prior to this in the MCU. Do subsequent films redeem Tony and actually address this guilt in any capacity? What do you think? Admittedly, I did not watch the entire compendium of MCU films before doing this, so if any of them actually do delve into this and capitalize on the continuation of Tony's arc and experiences with guilt and blame and his journey of growth and contending with grief, I wouldn't necessarily be cognizant of that. So please keep that in mind, and I will see you soon. Thank you for watching.